Frodo was lying face upward on the ground, and the monster was bending over him, so intent upon her victim that she took no heed of Sam and his cries until he was close at hand. As he rushed up, he saw that Frodo was already bound in cords, wound about him from ankle to shoulder, and the monster, with her great forelegs, was beginning half to lift, half to drag his body away. On the near side of him lay, gleaming on the ground, his elven blade, where it had fallen useless from his grasp. Sam did not wait to wonder what was to be done, or whether he was brave or loyal or filled with rage. He sprang forward with a yell, and seized his master's sword in his left hand. Then he charged. No onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts, where some desperate small creature armed with little teeth alone will spring upon a tower of horn and hide that stands above its fallen mate. Disturbed as if out of some gloating dream by his small yell, she turned slowly, the dreadful malice of her glance upon him. But almost before she was aware what a fury was upon her, greater than any she had known in this countless years, the shining sword bit upon her foot and tore away the cloak. Sam sprang inside the arches of her legs, and with a quick upthrust of his other hand stabbed at the clustering eyes upon her lower head. One great eye went dark. Now the miserable creature was right under her. For the moment, out of the reach of her sting and of her claws, her vast belly was above him with its putrid light, and the stench of it almost smote him down. Still, his fury held for one more blow, and before she could sink upon him, smothering him in all his little impudence of courage, he slashed the bright elven blade across her with desperate strength. But shield was not as dragons are. No softer spot had she save only her eyes. Knobbed and pitted with corruption was her age-old hide, but ever thickened from within with layer on layer of evil growth. The blade scored it with a dreadful gash, but those hideous folds could not be pierced by any strength of men. Not though elf or dwarf should forge the steel or the hand of Beren or Turin wield it. She yielded to the stroke, and then heaved up the great bag of her belly high above Sam's head. Poison throbbed and bubbled from the wound. Now splaying her legs, she drove her huge bulk down on him again. Too soon, for Sam still stood upon his feet, and dropping his own sword, with both hands he held the elven blade point upwards, fending off that ghastly roof. And so Shelob, with the driving force of her own cruel will, with strength greater than any warrior's hand, thrust herself upon a bitter spike. Deep it pricked, as Sam was crushed slowly to the ground. No such anguish had Shelob ever known, or dreamed of knowing in all her long world of wickedness. Not the doughtiest soldier of old Gondor, nor the most savage orc entrapped, had ever thus endured her, or set blade to her beloved flesh. A shudder went through her. Heaving up again, wrenching away from the pain, she bent her writhing limbs beneath her, and sprang backwards in a compulsive leap. Sam had fallen to his knees by Frodo's head, his senses reeling in the foul stench, his two hands still gripping the hilt of the sword. Through the mist before his eyes, he was aware dimly of Frodo's face, and stubbornly he fought to master himself and drag himself out of this wound that was upon him. Slowly he raised his head, and saw her, only a few paces away, eyeing him, her beak drabbing a spittle of venom, and a green ooze trickling from below her wounded eye. There she crouched, her shuddering belly splayed upon the ground, the great boughs of her legs quivering, as she gathered herself for another spring, this time to crush and sting to death. No little bite of poison to still the struggling of her meat, this time to slay, and then to rend. Even as Sam himself crouched, looking at her, seeing his death in her eyes, a thought came to him as if some remote voice had spoken, and he fumbled in his breast with his left hand, and found what he sought. Cold and hard and solid it seemed to his touch. In a phantom world of horror, the phial of Galadriel. "Galadriel!" he said faintly, and then he heard voices far off but clear, the crying of the elves as they walked under the stars in the beloved shadows of the Shire, and the music of the elves as it came through his sleep in the Hall of Fire, in the house of Elrond. "Gilthoniel a Elbereth!" And then his tongue was loosened, and his voice cried in a language which he did not know. Elbereth Gilthoniel, o Menel Palandiriel, Lenalon Sinin Nulgungruth, Actionin Fanuilos. And with that, he staggered to his feet, and was Samwise the Hobbit, Handfast's son again. "Now come, you filth!" he cried,
You've hurt my master, you brute, and you'll pay for it. We're going on, but we'll settle with you first. Come on and taste it again!
As if his indomitable spirit had set its potency in motion, the glass blazed suddenly like a white torch in his hand. It flamed like a star that, leaping from the firmament, sears the dark air with intolerable light. No such terror out of heaven had ever burned in Shelob's face before. The beams of it entered into her wounded head and scalded with unbearable pain, and the dreadful infection of light spread from eye to eye. She fell back, beating the air with her forelegs, her sides blasted by inner lightnings, her mind in agony. Then, turning her maimed head away, she groped aside and began to crawl, claw by claw, towards the opening of the dark cliff behind. Sam came on. He was reeling like a drunken man, but he came on, and Shelob cowered at last, shrunken in defeat, jerked and quivered as she tried to hasten from him. She reached the hole, and squeezing down, leaving a trail of green-yellow slime, she slipped in, even as Sam hewed a last stroke at her dragging legs. Then he fell to the ground. Shelob was gone, and whether she lay long in her lair, nursing her malice and her misery, and in slow years of darkness healed herself from within, rebuilding her clustered eyes until with hunger like death she spun once more her dreadful snares in the glens of the mountains of shadow, this tale does not tell. Sam was left alone, wearily as the evening of the nameless land fell upon the place of battle. He crawled back to his master.
Master! Dear master!
He said, but Frodo did not speak. As he had run forward, eager, rejoicing to be free, Shelob with hideous speed had come behind, and with one swift stroke had stung him in the neck. He lay now pale, and heard no voice, and did not move.
Master! Dear master!
Said Sam, and through a long silence waited, listening in vain. Then, as quickly as he could, he cut away the binding cords and laid his head upon Frodo's breast and to his mouth. But no stir of life could he find, nor feel the faintest flutter of the heart. Often he chafed his master's hands and feet, and touched his brow, but all were cold.
Frodo! Mr. Frodo!
He called.
Don't leave me here alone! It's your Sam calling. Don't go. Don't go where I can't follow. Wake up, Mr. Frodo! Oh, wake up! Frodo! Hear me! Me dear! Wake up!
Then anger surged over Hint, and he ran about his master's body in a rage, stabbing the air, and smiting the stones and shouting challenges. Presently he came back, and bending looked at Frodo's face, pale beneath him in the dusk, and suddenly he saw that he was in the picture that was revealed to him in the mirror of Galadriel and Lorien. Frodo with the pale face, lying fast asleep under a great dark cliff. Or fast asleep he had thought then.
He's dead,
He said.
not asleep. Dead.
And as he said it, as if the words had set the venom to its work again, it seemed to him that the hue of the face grew livid green, and then black despair came down on him, and Sam bowed to the ground, and drew his grey hood over his head, and night came into his heart, and he knew no more. When at last the blackness passed, Sam looked up and shadows were about him. But for how many minutes or hours the world had gone dragging on, he could not tell. He was still in the same place, and still his master lay beside him dead. The mountains had not crumbled, nor the earth fallen into ruin.
What shall I do? What shall I do?
He said,
Did I come all this way with him for nothing?
and then he remembered his own voice speaking words at that time he did not understand himself, at the beginning of their journey.
I have something to do before the end. I must see it through, sir, if you understand.
Oh, but what can I do? Not leave Mr. Frodo dead, unburied on the top of the mountains and go home? Or go on? Go on?
He repeated, and for a moment doubt and fear shook him.
Go on. Is that what I've got to do? And leave him?
Then at last, he began to weep. And going to Frodo, he composed his body, and folded his cold hands upon his breast, and wrapped his cloak about him. And he laid his own sword at one side, and the staff that Faramir had given at the other.
If I'm to go on,
He said,
then I must take your sword. By your leave, Mr. Frodo. But I'll put this one to lie by you, as it lay by the old king at the barrow. And you've got your beautiful mithril coat on, from old Mr. Bilbo. And your star glass, Mr. Frodo. You did lend it to me, and I'll need it. For I'll be always in the dark now. It's too good for me. The lady gave it to you, but maybe she'd understand. Do you understand, Mr. Frodo? I've got to go on.
but he could not go. Not yet. He knelt and held Frodo's hand and could not release it. And time went by, and still he knelt, holding his master's hand, and in his heart keeping a debate. Now he tried to find strength to tear himself away and go on a lonely journey. For vengeance. If once he could go, his anger would bear him down on all the roads of the world, pursuing until he had him at last. Gollum. Then Gollum would die in a corner. But that was not what he had set out to do. It would not be worthwhile to leave his master for that. It would not bring him back. Nothing would. They had better both be dead together. And that, too, would be a lonely journey. He looked on the bright point of the sword. He thought of the places behind where there was a black brink and an empty fall into nothingness. There was no escape that way. It was to do nothing. Not even to grieve. That was not what he had set out to do.
What am I to do then?
He cried again, and now he seemed plainly to know the hard answer. See it through. Another lonely journey. And the worst.
What? Me alone? Go to the crack of doom and all?
He quailed still, but the resolve grew.
What? Me, take the ring from him! The council gave it to him,
But the answer came at once.
and the council gave him companions, so that the errand should not fail. And you are the last of the company. The errand must not fail. Oh, I wish I wasn't the last.
He groaned.
I wish old Gandalf was here, or somebody. Why am I left all alone to make up my mind? I'll sure to go wrong. And it's not for me to go taking the ring, putting myself forward. But you haven't put yourself forward. You've been put forward. And as for not being the right and proper person, why, Mr. Frodo wasn't, as you might say. Nor Mr. Bilbo. They didn't choose themselves. Oh, well. I must make up my own mind. I will make it up. But I'll be sure to go wrong. That be Sam Gamgee all over. Let me see now. If we're found here, or Mr. Frodo's found, and that thing's on him, well, the enemy will get it. And that's the end of all of us. Of Lorien, and Rivendell, and the Shire and all. And there's no time to lose. Or it'll be the end anyway. And more than likely things are all going the enemy's way already. No chance to go back with it and get advice or permission. No. It's sit here till they come and kill me over Master's body. And gets it. Or I take it and go.
He drew a deep breath.
Then I take it is.
He stooped. Very gently he undid the clasp at the neck and slipped his hand inside Frodo's tunic. Then with his other hand raising the head, he kissed the cold forehead and slowly drew the chain over him. And then the head lay quietly back again in rest. No change came over the still face. And by that, more than by all other tokens, Sam was convinced that at last Frodo had died and laid aside the quest.
Goodbye, Master, my dear.
he muttered.
Forgive your Sam. He'll come back to this spot when the job's done, if he manages it. And then he'll not leave you again. Rest you quiet till I come, and may no foul creature come anigh you. If the lady could hear me and give me one wish, I will wish to come back and find you again. Goodbye.
And then he bent his own neck and put the chain upon him. And at once his head was bowed to the ground with the weight of the ring, as if a great stone had been strung on him. But slowly, as if the weight became less, or new strength grew in him, he raised his head, and then with a great effort got to his feet, and found that he could walk and bear his burden. And for a moment he lifted up the phial, and looked down at his master. And the light burned gently now with the soft radiance of the evening star in summer. And in that light, Frodo's face was fair of hue again, pale but beautiful with an elvish beauty, as of one who has long passed the shadows. And with the bitter comfort of that last sight, Sam turned and hid the light and stumbled on into the growing dark. He had not far to go. The tunnel was some way behind, the cleft a couple of 100 yards ahead or less. The path was visible in the dusk, a deep rut worn with ages of passage, running now gently up a long trough with cliffs on either side. The trough narrowed rapidly. Soon Sam came to a long flight of broad shallow steps. Now the Orc Tower was right above him, frowning black, and in it the red eye glowed. Now he was hidden in the dark shadow under it. He was coming to the top of the steps and was in the cleft at last.
I've made up my mind. I've made up my mind,
he kept saying to himself. But he had not. Though he had done his best to think it out, what he was doing was altogether against the grain of his nature.
Have I got it wrong?
He muttered,
What ought I to have done?
as the sheer sides of the cleft closed about him. Before he reached the actual summit, before he looked at last on the path descending into the nameless land, he turned. For a moment motionless in intolerable doubt, he looked back. He could still see, like a small blot in the gathering gloom, the mouth of the tunnel, and he thought he could see or guess where Frodo lay. He fancied there was a glimmer on the ground down there, or perhaps it was some trick of his tears, as he peered out at that high stony place where all his life had fallen in ruin.
If only I could have my wish, my one wish,
He sighed.
to go back and find him.
Then at last he turned to the road in front and took a few steps, the heaviest and most reluctant he had ever taken. Only a few steps, and now only a few more, and he would be going down and would never see that high place again. And then suddenly, he heard cries and voices. He stood still as stone. Orc voices. They were behind him, and before him, a noise of tramping feet and harsh shouts. Orcs were coming up to the cleft from the far side, from some entry to the tower perhaps. Tramping feet and shouts behind. He wheeled round and saw small red lights, torches, winking away below there as they issued from the tunnel. At last the hunt was up. The red eye of the tower had not been blind. He was caught. Now the flicker of approaching torches and the clink of steel ahead was very near. In a minute they would reach the top and beyond him. He had taken too long in making up his mind, and now it was no good. How could he escape or save himself? Or save the ring? The ring. He was not aware of any thought or decision. He simply found himself drawing out the chain and taking the ring in his hand. The head of the Orc company appeared in the cleft right before him. Then he put it on. The world changed, and a single moment of time was filled with an hour of thought. At once he was aware that hearing was sharpened while sight was dimmed, but otherwise than in Shelob's lair, all things about him now were not dark, but vague, while he himself was there in a grey hazy world, alone, like a small black solid rock, and the ring, weighing down his left hand, was like an orb of hot gold. He did not feel invisible at all, but horribly and uniquely visible, and he knew that somewhere an eye was searching for him. He heard the crack of stone, and the murmur of water far off in Morgul Vale, and down away under the rock of the bubbling misery of Shelob groping lost in some blind passage, and voices in the dungeons of the tower. and the cries of the orcs as they came out of the tunnel, and deafening roaring in his ears, the crash of the feet and the rending clamour of the orcs before him. He shrank against the cliff. But they marched up like a phantom company, grey distorted figures in a mist, only dreams of fear with pale flames in their hands. And they passed him by. He cowered, trying to creep away into some cranny and to hide. He listened. The orcs from the tunnel and the others marching down had sighted one another, and both parties were now hurrying and shouting. He heard them both clearly, and he understood what they said. Perhaps the ring gave understanding of tongues, or simply understanding especially of the servants of Sauron, its maker, so that if he gave heed, he understood and translated the thought to himself. Certainly the ring had grown greatly in power as it approached the places of its forging. But one thing it did not confer, and that was courage. At present Sam still thought only of hiding, of lying low till all was quiet again. And he listened anxiously. He could not tell how near the voices were. The words seemed almost in his ears.
What are you doing up here? Have enough of war already?
Orders, you lubber. And what are you doing, Shagrat? Tired of lurking up here, thinking of coming down to fight?
Orders to you? I'm in command of this pass, so speak civil. What's to report?
Nothing.
Hey, hey, hey!
A yell broke into the exchange of the leaders. The orcs lower down had suddenly seen something. They began to run. So did the others.
Hey, hola! There's something lying in the road. A spy! A spy!
There was a hoot of snarling horns and a babble of baying voices. With the dreadful stroke, Sam was wakened from his cowering mood. They had seen his master. What would they do? He had heard tales of the orcs to make the blood run cold. It could not be borne. He sprang up. He flung the quest and all his decisions away, and fear and doubt with them. He knew now where his place was, and had been, at his master's side, though what he could do there was not clear. Back he ran down the steps, down the path towards Frodo.
How many are there?
He thought.
30 or 40 from the tower at least. And a lot more than from down below, I guess. How many can I kill before they get me? They'll see the flame of the sword as soon as I draw it, and they'll get me sooner or later. I wonder if any song will mention it. How Samwise fell in the high pass and made a wall of bodies around his master. No song. Of course not, for the ring will be found and there'll be no more songs. I can't help it. My place is by Mr. Frodo. They must understand that. Elrond and the council, the great lords and ladies in all their wisdom, their plans have gone wrong. I can't be their ring bearer. Not without Mr. Frodo.
But the orcs were out of his dim sight now. He had had no time to consider himself, but now he realized that he was weary almost to exhaustion. His legs would not carry him as he wished. He was too slow. The path seemed miles long. Where had they all gone to in the mist? There they were again, a good way ahead still, a cluster of figures round something lying on the ground. A few seemed to be darting this way and that, bent like dogs on a trail. He tried to make a spurt.
Come on, Sam,
He said.
or you'll be too late again.
He loosened the sword in his sheath. In a minute he could draw it, and then there was a wild clamor, hooting and laughing as something was lifted from the ground. Then a voice shouted.
Off the quick work, John the King. Will not trouble us to the other side.
The whole band of orc figures began to move. 4 in the middle were carrying a body high on their shoulders. They had taken Frodo's body. They were off. He could not catch them up. Still he labored on. The orcs reached the tunnel and were passing in. Those with the burden went first, and behind them there was a good deal of struggling and jostling. Sam came on. He drew the sword, a flicker of blue in his wavering hand. But they did not see it. Even as he came panting up, the last of them vanished into the black hole. For a moment he stood, gasping, clutching his breast. Then he drew his sleeve across his face, wiping away the grime and sweat and tears.
Curse the filth,
He said, and sprang after them into the darkness. It no longer seemed very dark to him in the tunnel. Rather, it was as if he had stepped out of a thin mist into a heavier fog. His weariness was growing, but his will hardened all the more. He thought he could see the light torches a little way ahead. But try as he would, he could not catch them up. Orcs go fast in tunnels, and this tunnel they knew well, for in spite of Shelob, they were forced to use it often as the swiftest way from the dead city over the mountains. In what far-off time the main tunnel and the great round pit had been made where Shelob had taken up her abode in ages past, they did not know. But many byways they had themselves delved about in on either side. so as to escape the lair in their goings to and fro on the business of their masters. Tonight they did not intend to go far down, but were hastening to find a side passage that led back to their watchtower on the cliff. Most of them were gleeful, delighted with what they had found and seen, and as they ran they grabbled and yammered after the fashion of their kind. Sam heard the noise of their harsh voices flat and hard in the dead air, and he could distinguish two voices from among all the rest. They were louder and nearer to him. The captains of the two parties seemed to be bringing up the rear, debating as they went.
Stop your rabble making such a racket, Shagrat!
Grunted the one.
We don't want Sheila with us.
Go on, Gorback. You're making more than half the noise.
Said the other.
The man's plain. No need to worry about Sheila for a bit, I reckon. She's sat on a nail, it seems, and we shan't cry about that. Didn't you see a nasty mess all the way back to that cursed crack of hers? If we've stopped it once, we've stopped it 100 times. So let them laugh, and we've struck a bit of luck at last. Got something that Lookbirds wants.
Lookbirds wants it, eh? What is it, you think? Envy should look to me, but undersized. What's the danger in a thing like that?
Don't know till we've had a look.
Oh, so they haven't told you what to expect. They don't tell us all they know, do they? Not by half. But they can make mistakes. Even the top ones can.
Shagrat's voice was lowered, so that even with his strangely sharpened hearing, Sam could only just catch what was said.
They may, but they've got eyes and ears everywhere. Some among my lot like as not, but there's no doubt about it. They've troubled about something. From Nazgul down below are, by your account, and the birds is too. Something nearly slipped.
Nearly, you say?
Said Gorbag.
All right,
Said Shagrat.
but we'll talk of that later. Wait till we get to the underway. There's a place there where we can talk a bit while the lads go on.
Shortly afterwards, Sam saw the torches disappear. Then there was a rumbling noise, and just as they hurried up, a bump. As far as he could guess, the orcs had turned and gone into the very opening which Frodo and he had tried and found blocked. It was still blocked. There seemed to be a great stone in the way, but the orcs had gone through somehow, for he could hear their voices on the other side. They were still running along, deeper and deeper into the mountain, back towards the tower. Sam felt desperate. They were carrying off his master's body for some foul purpose, and he could not follow. He thrust and pushed at the block, and he threw himself against it, but it did not yield. Then, not far inside, or so he thought, he heard the two captains' voices talking again. He stood still, listening for a little, hoping perhaps to learn something useful. Perhaps Gorbag, who seemed to belong to Minas Morgul, would come out, and he would then slip in.
No, I don't know.
Said Gorbag's voice.
The messages go through quicker than anything could fly, as a rule, but I don't inquire how it's done. Safest not to. Those Nazgul give me the creeps, and they skin the body off you as soon as look at you, and leave you all cold in the dark on the other side. But he likes them. They're his favourites nowadays, so it's no use grumbling. I'll tell you, it's no game serving down in the city.
You should try being up here with Shelob for company.
Said Shagrat.
I'd like to try somewhere where there's none of them. But the war's on now, and when that's over, things may be easier. It's going well, they say.
They would.
Grunted Gorbag.
We'll see. But anyway, if it does go well, there should be a lot more room. What do you say? If we get a chance, you and me'll slip off and set up somewhere on our own, with a few trusty lads, somewhere where there's good loot nice and handy, and no big bosses.
Said Shagrat.
Like old times.
Yes,
Said Gorbag.
but don't count on it. I'm not easy in my mind. As I said, the big bosses,
His voice sank almost to a whisper.
even the biggest can make mistakes. Something nearly slipped, you say? I say something has slipped, and we've got to look out. Always the poor looks to put slips right in small things. But don't forget, the enemies don't love us any more than they love him. And if they get topsides on him, we're done too. But see here, where were you ordered out?
About an hour ago, just before you saw us, a message came. Nazgul uneasy. Spies feared on stairs. Double vigilance. patrolled to head of stairs. I came at once.
Bad business.
said Gorbag.
See here, our silent watchers were uneasy more than 2 days ago, that I know. But my patrol wasn't ordered out for another day, nor any message sent to lugboats either, owing to the great signal going up in the High Nazgul, going off to the war and all that. And then they couldn't get lugboats to pay attention for a good while, I'm told.
The Eye was busy elsewhere, I suppose.
Said Shagrat.
Big things going on away west, they say.
I dare say.
Growled Gorbag.
But in the meantime, enemies have gone up the stairs. And what were you up to? You're supposed to keep watch, aren't you? Special orders or no? What are you for?
That's enough. Don't try and teach me my job. We were awake, all right. We knew there were funny things going on.
Very funny.
Yes, very funny. Lights and shouting and all. But Sheila was on the go. My lad saw her and her sneak.
Her sneak, what's that?
You must have seen him. Little thin black fellow, like a spider himself, or perhaps more than a starved frog. He's been here before. Came out of Lurkbirds the first time years ago, and we had word from high up to let him pass. He's been up the stairs once or twice since then, but we've left him alone. Seems to have some understanding with the ladyship. I suppose he's no good to eat. She wouldn't worry about words from high up. But a fine guard you keep in the valley. He was up here day before all this racket. Early last night we saw him. Anyway, my lads reported that her ladyship was having some fun. And that seemed good enough for me until message came. I thought her sneak had brought her a toy, or that you'd perhaps sent her a present, a prisoner of war or something. I don't interfere when she's playing. Nothing gets my Sheila when she's on the hunt.
Nothing, say you.
Didn't you use your eyes back there? I tell you, I'm not easy in my mind. Whatever came up the stairs did get by. I cut her web and got clean out of the hole. That's something to think about.
Ah, well, she got him in the end, didn't she?
Got him? Got who? This little fellow. But if he was the only one, then she'd have had him off to her larder long before, and there he'd be now. And if Lugbats wanted him, you'd have to go and get him. Nice for you. But there was more than one.
At this point, Sam began to listen more attentively and pressed his ear against the stone.
Who cut the cord she'd put round him, Shagrat?
Same one as cut the web.
Didn't you see that? And who stuck a pin into her ladyship?
Same one, I reckon.
And where is he? Where is he, Shagrat?
Shagrat made no reply.
You may well put your thinking cap on if you've got one. It's no laughing matter.
No one has ever stuck a pin in Shelob before, as you should know well enough. There's no grief in that, but think. There's someone loose hereabouts as is more dangerous than any other damned rebel that ever walked since the bad old times, since the great siege. Something has slipped.
And what is it then?
By all the signs, Captain Shagrat, I'd say there's a large warrior loose. Elf, most likely, with an elf sword anyway, and an axe as well, maybe. And he's loose in your bounds too. And you've never spotted him.
Very funny indeed.
Gorbag spat. Sam smiled grimly at his description of himself.
Ah, well, you always did have a gloomy view,
said Shagrat.
You can read the signs how you like, but there may be other ways to explain them. Anyhow, I've got watchers at every point, and I'm going to deal with one thing at a time. When I've had a look at the fellow we have caught, then I'll begin to worry about something else.
It's my guess that you won't find much in that little fellow,
said Gorbag.
He may have nothing to do with the real mischief. The big fellow with the sharp sword doesn't seem to have thought him worth much anyhow. Just left him lying. Regular elvish trick.
We'll see. Come on now. We've talked enough. Let's go and have a look at the prisoner.
What are you going to do with him? Don't forget I spotted him first. If there's any game, me and my lads must be in it.
No.
Growled Shagrat.
I have my orders, and it's more than my belly's worth or yours to break 'em. Any trespasser found by the guards is to be held at the tower. Prisoners to be stripped. Full description of every article, garment, weapon, letter, ring, or trinket is to be sent to Lugbirds at once, and to Lugbirds only. And the prisoners to be kept safe and intact, under pain of death for every member of the guard until he sends. or comes himself. That's plain enough, and that's what I'm going to do.
Stripped, eh?
said Gorbag.
Wait, teeth, nails, hair and all?
No, none of that. He's full of birds, I tell you. He's wanted safe and whole.
You'll find that difficult.
Laughed Gorbag.
He's nothing but carry-on now. What no birds will do with such stuff I can't guess. He might as well go in the pot.
You fool!
Snarled Shagrat.
You've been talking very clever, but there's a lot you don't know most other folk do. You'll be full of pot for Shelob if you don't take care. Carrion! Is that all you know of her ladyship? When she binds with cords, she's after meat. She doesn't eat dead meat nor suck cold blood. This fellow isn't dead.
Sam reeled, clutching at the stone. He felt as if the whole dark world was turning upside down. So great was the shock that he almost swooned, but he didn't. But even as he fought to keep hold of his senses, deep inside him he was aware of the comment. For the moment nothing, but to prop himself against the unmoving stone and listen. Listen to the vile orc voices.
Garl,
Said Shagrat.
she's got more than one poison. When she's hunting, she just give 'em a dab with the neck, and they go as limp as a bone fish. And then she has her way with them. Do you remember old Ufthak? We lost him for days. Then we found him in a corner, hanging up as he was, but he was wide awake and glaring. How we laughed! She'd forgotten him, maybe, but we didn't touch him, no good interfering with her. This little filth. He'll wake up in a few hours, and beyond feeling a bit sick for a hit, he'll be alright. Or would be if Logbirds would let him alone. And of course, beyond wondering where he is and what's happened to him.
And what's going to happen to him?
Laughed Gorbag.
We can tell him a few stories at any rate if we can't do anything else. I don't suppose he's ever been in lovely Logbird, so he may like to know what to expect. This is going to be more funny than I thought. Let's go.
There's going to be no fun, I tell you.
Said Shagrat.
And he's got to be kept safe, or we're all as good as dead.
All right. But if I were you, I'd catch up the big one that's loose before you send in any report to Logbirds. It won't sound too...
The voices began to move away. Sam heard the sound of feet receding. He was recovering from his shock, and now a wild fury was on him.
I got it all wrong.
He cried.
I knew I would. Now they've got him. The devils. The filth. Never leave your master. Never, never. That was my right rule, and now And I knew in my heart. Oh, may I be forgiven. Now I've got to get back to him. Somehow.
He drew his sword again and beat on the stone with the hilt. But it only gave a dull sound. The sword, however, blazed so brightly now that he could see dimly in this light. To his surprise, he noticed the great block was shaped like a heavy door, and was less than twice its own height. Above it was a dark blank space between the top and the low arch of the opening. It was probably only meant to be a stop against the intrusion of Shelob, fastened on the inside with some latch or bolt beyond the reach of her cunning. With this remaining strength, Sam leapt and caught the top, scrambled up and dropped, and then he ran madly, sword blazing in hand, round a bend and up a winding tunnel. The news that his master was still alive roused him to a last effort beyond thought of weariness. He could not see anything ahead, for this new passage twisted and turned constantly, but he thought he was catching the two orcs up. Their voices were growing near again. Now they seemed quite close.
That's what I'm going to do.
Said Shagrat in angry tones.
Put him right up in the top chamber.
What for?
Growled Gorbag.
Haven't you any lockups down below?
He's going out of harm's way, I tell you.
Answered Shagrat.
See? He's precious. I don't trust all my lads, and none of yours, nor you neither. When you're mad for fun, he's going where I want him, and where you won't come if you don't keep civil. Up to the top, I say. He'll be safe there.
Said Sam.
You're forgetting the great big elvish warrior that's loose.
And with what he raced round the last corner, only to find that by some trick of the tunnel, or of the hearing which the ring gave him, he had misjudged the distance. The two orc figures were still some way ahead. He could see them now, black and squat against the red glare. The passage ran straight at last, up an incline, and at the end, wide open, were great double doors. leading probably to deep chambers far below the high horn of the tower. Already the orcs with their burden had passed inside. Gorbag and Shagrat were drawing near the gate. Sam heard a burst of hoarse singing, blaring of horns and banging of gongs. A hideous clamour. Gorbag and Shagrat were already on the threshold. Sam yelled, brandished Sting, but his little voice was drowned in the tumult. No one heeded him. The great door slammed to. Boom. The bars of iron fell into place inside. Clang. The gate was shut. Sam hurled himself against the bolted brazen plates and fell senseless to the ground. He was out in the darkness. Frodo was alive, but taken by the enemy. Here ends the second part of the history of the War of the Ring. The third part tells of the last defense against the Shadow and the end of the mission of the Ring-Bearer, in The Return of the King. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Part 3. The Return of the King. Pippin looked out from the shelter of Gandalf's cloak. He wondered if he was awake or still sleeping, still in the swift-moving dream in which he had been wrapped so long since the great ride began. The dark world was rushing by, and the wind sang soundly in his ears. He could see nothing but the wheeling stars, and away to his right vast shadows against the sky, where the mountains of the south marched past. Sleepily he tried to reckon the times and stages of their journey, but his memory was drowsy and uncertain. There had been the first ride at terrible speed without halt, and then in the dawn he had seen a pale gleam of gold, and they had come to the silent town and the great empty house of the hill. And hardly had they reached this shelter when the winged shadow had passed over once again, and men wilted in fear. But Gandalf had spoken soft words to him, and he had slept in a corner, tired but uneasy, dimly aware of comings and goings, and of men talking and Gandalf giving orders. And then again riding in the night. This was the the third night since he had looked in the stone, and with that hideous memory he woke fully, and shivered, and the noise of the wind became filled with menacing voices. A light kindled in the sky, a blaze of yellow fire behind dark barriers. Pippin cowered back, afraid for a moment, wondering into what dreadful country Gandalf was bearing him. He rubbed his eyes, and then he saw that it was the moon, rising above the eastern shadows, now almost at the full, so the night was not yet old, and for hours the dark journey would go on. He stirred and spoke.
Where are we, Gandalf?
He asked.
In the realm of Gondor,
The wizard answered.
the land of Anurien is still passing by.
There was a silence again for a while. Then,
What is that?
cried Pippin suddenly, clutching at Gandalf's cloak.
Look! Fire! Red fire! Are there dragons in this land? Look! There is another!
For answer, Gandalf cried aloud to his horse.
On, Shadowfax, we must hasten. Time is short. See, the beacons of Gondor are alight, calling for aid. War is kindled. See, there is the fire of Amondine, and flame on Elenach, and there they go, speeding west. Nardor, Erelas, Min Rimon, Calenhad, and the Halifirian on the borders of Rohan.
But Shadowfax paused in his stride, slowing to a walk. And then he lifted up his head and neighed. And out of the darkness the answering neigh of other horses came. And presently the thudding of hooves was heard, and 3 riders swept up and passed like flying ghosts in the moon, and vanished into the west. Then Shadowfax gathered himself together and sprang away, and the night flowed over him like a roaring wind. Pippin became drowsy again, and paid little attention to Gandalf telling him of the customs of Gondor, and how the lord of the city had beacons built on the tops of outlying hills along both borders of the Great Range, and maintained posts at these points where fresh horses were always in readiness to bear his errand riders to Rohan in the north, or to Belfalas in the south.
It is long since the beacons of Gondor were lit,
He said.
and in the ancient days of Gondor they were not needed, for they had the 7 stones.
Pippin stirred uneasily.
Sleep again, and do not be afraid,
Said Gandalf.
for you are not going like Frodo to Mordor, but to Minas Tirith, and there you will be as safe as you can be anywhere these days. If Gondor falls, or the ring is taken, then the Shire will be no refuge.
You do not comfort me.
Said Pippin. But nonetheless, sleep crept over him. The last thing that he remembered before he fell into deep dream was a glimpse of high white peaks, glimmering like flowing isles above the clouds as they caught the light of the westering moon. He wondered where Frodo was, and if he was already in Mordor, or if he was dead. And he did not know that Frodo, from far away, looked on that same moon as it set beyond Gondor, ere the coming of the day. Pippin woke to the sound of voices. Another day of hiding and a night of journey had fleeted by. It was twilight. The cold dawn was at hand again, and chill grey mists were about them. Shadowfax stood steaming with sweat, but he held his neck proudly and showed no signs of weariness. Many tall men, heavily cloaked, stood beside him, and behind them in the mist loomed a wall of stone, partly ruinous it seemed, but already before the night was past, the sound of hurried labour could be heard. Beat of hammers, clink of trowels, and the creak of wheels. Torches and flares glowed dully here and there in the fog. Gandalf was speaking to the men that barred his way, and as he listened, Pippin became aware that he himself was being discussed. Said the leader of the men.
What is he? A dwarf out of the mountains in the north? We wish for no strangers in the land this time, unless they be mighty men of arms in whose faith and help we can trust.
I will vouch for him before the seat of Denethor,
Said Gandalf.
and as for valor, that cannot be computed by stature. He has passed through more battles and perils than you have, Ingold, though you be twice his height. And he comes now from the storming of Isengard, of which we bear tidings. And great weariness is on him, or I would wake him. His name is Peregrine, a very valiant man.
Said Ingold dubiously, and the others laughed.
Man!
Cried Pippin, now thoroughly roused.
Man? Indeed not. I'm a hobbit, and no more valiant than I am a man. Safe perhaps now and again by necessity. Do not let Gandalf deceive you. Many a doer of great deeds might say no more.
Said Ingold.
But what is a hobbit?
A halfling.
Answered Gandalf.
Nay, not the one that was spoken of.
He added, seeing the wonder in the men's faces.
Not he, yet one of his kindred.
Yes, and the one who journeyed with him.
Said Pippin.
And Boromir of your city was with us, and he saved me in the snows of the north, and at last was slain, defending me from many foes.
Peace!
Said Gandalf.
The news of that grief should have been told first to the father.
It has been guessed already,
Said Ingold.
for there have been strange portents here of late. But pass on now, quickly, for the Lord of Minas Tirith will be eager to see any that bear the latest tidings of his son, be it man or hobbit.
Said Pippin.
Little service can I offer your lord, but what I can do, I would do, remembering Boromir the Brave. Fare you well.
Said Ingold, and the men made way for Shadowfax, and he passed through a narrow gate in the wall. Ingold cried.
Because I come seldom, but when my help is needed.
Answered Gandalf.
And as for counsel to you, I would say that you are over late in repairing the wall of Pelennor. Courage will now be your best defense against the storm that is at hand. That, and such hope as I bring. For not all the tidings that I bring are evil, but leave your trowels, and sharpen your swords.
Said Ingold.
Do you know aught of them? Will they answer the summons, think you?
Yes, they will come. But they have fought many battles at your back. This road and no road looks towards safety any longer. Be vigilant! But for Gandalf's Stormcrow, you would have seen a host of foes coming out of Anurian, and no riders of Rohan. And you may yet. Fare you well, and sleep not!
Gandalf passed now into the wide land beyond the Ramas Echor. So the men of Gondor called the outwall that they had built with great labour after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy. For 10 leagues or more it ran from the mountain's feet, and so back again, enclosing its fence the fields of the Pelennor, fair and fertile townlands, on the long slopes and terraces falling to the deep levels of the Anduin. At its furthest point of the great gate of the city, northeastward, the wall was 4 leagues distant, and there from a frowning bank it overlooked the long flats beside the river. And men had made it high and strong. For at a point, upon the walled causeway, the road came in from the fords and bridges of Osgiliath, and passed through a guarded gate between embattled towers. At its nearest point, the wall was little more than 1 league from the city, and that was southeastward. There Anduin, going in a wide knee about the hills of Emin Armen in South Ithilien, bent sharply west, and the outwall rose upon its very brink. And beneath it lay quays and landings of the Harland for craft that came upstream from the southern fiefs. The townlands were rich, with wide tilth and many orchards, and homesteads there were with oast and garner, fold and byre, and many rills ripping through the green from the highlands down to Anduin. Yet the herdsmen and husbandmen that dwelt there were not many, and the most part of the people of Gondor lived in the 7 circles of the city, or in the high vales of the mountain borders, in Losanach, or further south in fair Lebanon, with its 5 swift streams. There dwelt a hardy folk between the mountains and the sea. They were reckoned men of Gondor, yet their blood was mingled, and they were short and swarthy, folk among them whose sires came more from the forgotten men who housed in the shadow of the hills in the dark years, ere the coming of the kings. But beyond, in the great fief of Belfalas, dwelt Prince Imrahil in his castle of Dol Amroth by the sea. And he was of high blood, and his folk also, tall men and proud, with sea-grey eyes. Now after Gandalf had ridden for some time, the light of day grew in the sky. Pippin roused himself and looked up. To his left lay a sea of mist, rising to a bleak shadow in the east. But to his right, great mountains reared their heads, ranging from the west to a steep and sudden end, as if in the making of the land the river had burst through a great barrier, carving out a mighty valley to be a land of battle and debate in times to come. And there where the white mountains of Eredimrace came to their end. He saw, as Gandalf had promised, the dark mass of Mount Mindoluin, the deep purple shadows of its high glens, and its tall face whitening in the rising day. And upon its outthrust knee was the guarded city, with its 7 walls of stone so strong and old that it seemed to have been not builded, but carven by giants out of the bones of the earth. Even as Pippin gazed in wonder, the walls passed from looming grey to white, blushing faintly in the dawn. And suddenly the sun climbed over the eastern shadow and sent forth a shaft that smote the face of the city. Then Pippin cried aloud, for the tower of Ecthelion, standing high within the topmost walls, shone out against the sky, glimmering like a spike of pearl and silver. Tall and fair and shapely, and its pinnacle glittered as if it were wrought of crystals, and white banners broke and fluttered from the battlements in the morning breeze, and high and far he heard a clear ringing of silver trumpets. So Gandalf and Peregrine rode to the great gate of the men of Gondor at the rising of the sun, and its iron doors rolled back before them. Men cried.
Now we know that the storm is indeed nigh. It is upon you,
said Gandalf.
I've ridden on its wings. Let me pass. I must come to your lord Denethor while his stewardship lasts. Whatever betide, you have come to the end of the Gondor that you have known. Let me pass!
Then men fell back before the command of his voice and questioned him no further, though they gazed in wonder at the hobbit that sat before him, and at the horse that bore him. For the people of the city used horses very little, and they were seldom seen in their streets, save only those ridden by the errand riders of their lord. And they said, surely that is one of the great steeds of the king of Rohan. Maybe the Rohirrim will come soon and strengthen us. But Shadowfax walked proudly up the long, winding road. For the fashion of Minas Tirith was such that it was built on 7 levels. Each delved into the hill, and about each was set a wall, and in each wall was a gate. But the gates were not set in a line. The great gate in the city was at the east point of the circuit, but the next faced half south, and the third half north, and so to and fro upwards, so that the paved way that climbed towards the citadel turned first this way and then that across the face of the hill. And each time that it passed the line of the great gate, it went through an arched tunnel, piercing a vast pier of rock, whose huge outthrust bulk divided in two all the circles of the city, save the first. For partly in the primeval shaping of the hill, partly by the mighty craft and labour of old, there stood up from the rear of the wide court behind the gate a towering bastion of stone, its edge sharp as a ship keel facing east. Up it rose, even to the level of the topmost circle, and there was crowned by a battlement, so that those in the citadel might, like mariners in the mountain's ship, look from its peak sheer down upon the gate, 700 feet below. The entrance to the citadel also looked eastward, but was delved in the heart of the rock. Thence a long lamp-lit slope ran up from the seventh gate. Thus men reached at last the high court, and the place of the fountain before the feet of the white tower, tall and shapely, 50 fathoms from its base to the pinnacle, where the banner of the stewards floated 1,000 feet above the plain. A strong citadel it was indeed, and not to be taken by a host of enemies, if there were any within that could hold weapons, unless some foe could come behind and scale the lower skirts of Mindolluin, and so come upon the narrow shoulder that joined the hill of guard and the mountain mass. But that shoulder, which rose to the height of the fifth wall, was hedged with great ramparts, right up to the precipice that overhung its western end, and in that space stood the houses and domed tombs of bygone kings and lords, forever silent between the mountain and the tower. Pippin gazed in growing wonder at the great stone city, vaster and more splendid than anything that he had dreamed of, greater and stronger than Isengard, and far more beautiful. Yet it was in truth falling year by year into decay, and already it lacked half of the men that could have dwelt at ease there. In every street they passed, some great house or court over whose doors and arched gates were carved many fair letters of strange and ancient shapes. Names Pippin guessed of great men and kindreds that had once dwelt there, and yet now they were silent, and no footsteps rang on their wide pavements, nor voice was heard in their halls, nor any face looked out from door or empty window. At last they came out of shadow to the seventh gate, and the warm sun that shone down beyond the river, as Frodo walked in the glades of Ithilien, glowed here on the smooth walls and rooted pillars, and the great arch with keystone carven in the likeness of a crowned and kingly head. Gandalf dismounted, for no horse was allowed in the citadel, and Shadowfax suffered himself to be laid away at the soft word of his master. The guards of the gate were robed in black, and their helms were of strange shape, high-crowned, with long cheek guards, close-fitting to the face, and above the cheek guards there were set the white wings of seabirds. But the helms gleamed with a flame of silver, for they were indeed wrought of mithril, heirlooms from the glory of old days. Upon the black surcoats were embroidered in white a tree blossoming like a snow beneath a silver crown and many pointed stars. This was the livery of the heirs of Elendil, and none wore it now in all Gondor, save the guards of the citadel, before the court of the fountain where the white tree once had grown. Already it seemed that word of their coming had gone before them, and at once they were admitted, silently, and without question. Quickly Gandalf strode across the white-paved court. A sweet fountain played there in the morning sun, and a sward of bright green lay about it. But in the midst, drooping over the pool, stood a dead tree, and the falling drops dripped sadly from its barren and broken branches back into the clear water. Pippin glanced at it as he hurried after Gandalf. It looked mournful, he thought, and he wondered why the dead tree was left in this place, where everything else was well tended.
7 stars and 7 stones and 1 white tree.
The words that Gandalf had murmured came back into his mind, and then he found himself at the doors of the great hall, beneath the gleaming tower, and behind the wizard he passed the tall, silent door wardens and entered the cool, echoing shadows of the House of Stone. They walked down a paved passage, long and empty, And as they went, Gandalf spoke softly to Pippin.
Be careful of your words, Master Peregrine. This is no time for hobbit pertness. Theoden is a kindly old man. Denethor is of another sort. Proud and subtle. A man of far greater lineage and power, though he is not called a king. But he will speak most to you, and question you much, since you can tell him of his son Boromir. He loved him greatly. Too much, perhaps, and the more so because they were unlike. But under cover of his love, he will think it easier to learn what he wishes of you, rather than from me. Do not tell him more than you need, and leave quiet the matter of Frodo's errand. I will deal with that in due time, and say nothing about Aragorn either, unless you must.
Why not? What's wrong with Strider?
Pippin whispered.
He meant to come here, didn't he? And he'll be arriving soon himself anyway.
Maybe, said Gandalf. Though if he comes, it is likely to be in some way that no one expects. Not even Denethor. It will be better so. At least you should come unheralded by us.
Gandalf halted before a tall door of polished metal.
See, Master Pippin, there is no time to instruct you now in the history of Gondor, though it might have been better if you had learned something of it, when you were still birds nesting and playing truant in the woods of the Shire. Do as I bid. It is scarcely wise when bringing the news of the death of his heir to a mighty lord, to speak over much of the coming of the one who will, if he comes, claim the kingship. Is that enough?
Kingship?
Said Pippin, amazed.
Yes,
Said Gandalf.
if you have walked all these days with closed ears and mind asleep, wake up now.
He knocked on the door. The door opened, but no one could be seen to open it. Pippin looked into a great hall. It was lit by deep windows in the wide aisles at either side. Beyond the rows of tall pillars that upheld the roof, monoliths of black marble, they rose to great capitals, carved in many strange figures of beasts and leaves, and far above, in shadow, the wide vaulting gleamed with dull gold, inset with flowing traceries of many colours. No hangings or storied webs, nor any things of woven stuff or of wood were to be seen in that long solemn hall. But between the pillars there stood a silent company of tall images graven in cold stone. Suddenly Pippin was reminded of the hewn rocks of Argonath, and awe fell on him as he looked down that avenue of kings long dead. At the far end, upon a dais of many steps, was set a high throne under a canopy of marble, shaped like a crowned helm. Behind it was carved upon the wall and set with gems an image of a tree in flower. But the throne was empty. At the foot of the dais, upon the lowest step, which was broad and deep, there was a stone chair, black and unadorned, and on it sat an old man, gazing at his lap. In his hand was a white rod with a golden knob. He did not look up. Solemnly they paced the long floor towards him, until they stood 3 paces from his footstool. Then Gandalf spoke.
Hail, Lord and Steward of Minas Tirith, Denethor, son of Ecthelion. I am come with counsel and tidings in this dark hour.
Then the old man looked up. Pippin saw his carven face with its proud bones and skin like ivory, and the long curved nose between the dark deep eyes. And he was reminded not so much of Boromir as of Aragorn.
Dark indeed is the hour,
said the old man, and at such times you are wont to come, Mithrandir. But though all the signs forebode that the doom of Gondor is drawing nigh, less now to me is that darkness than my own darkness. It has been told to me that you bring with you one that saw my son die. Is this he?
It is,
said Gandalf.
One of the twain. The other is with Theoden of Rohan, and may come hereafter. Halflings they are, as you see, yet this is not he of whom the omen spoke. Yet a halfling still, said Denethor grimly, and little love do I bear the name, since those accursed words came to trouble our counsels and drew away my son on the wild errand to his death. My Boromir, now we have need of you. Faramir should have gone in his stead. He would have gone, said Gandalf. Be not unjust in your grief. Boromir claimed the errand and would not suffer anyone to have it. He was a masterful man, and one to take what he desired.
I journeyed far with him, and learned much of his mood. But you speak of his death. You have bad news of that ere we came. I have received this, said Denethor, and laying down his rod, he lifted from his lap the thing that he had been gazing at. In each hand he held up one half of a great horn cloven through the middle, a wild ox horn bound with silver.
That is the horn that Bombur always wore,
cried Pippin. Verily, said Denethor, and in my turn I bore it, and so did each eldest son of our house, far back into the vanished years before the fallings of the kings. Since Vorondil, father of Mardil, hunted the wild kine of Aror in the far fields of Rune. I heard it blowing dim upon the northern marches 13 days ago, and the river brought it to me, broken. It will wind no more. He paused, and there was a heavy silence. Suddenly he turned his black glance upon Pippin. What say you to that, halfling?
13 days.
Faltered Pippin.
Yes, I think that would be so. Yes, I stood beside him, and he blew the horn. But no help came. Only more orcs.
So, said Denethor, looking keenly at Pippin's face. Where were they? Tell me more. Why did not help come? And how did you escape, and yet he did not, so mighty a man as he was, and only orcs to withstand him? Pippin flushed and forgot his fear.
The mightiest man may be slain by one arrow,
he said.
And Boromir was pierced by many. When last I saw him, he sunk beside a tree and plucked a black feathered shaft from his side. Then I swooned and was made captive. I saw him no more, and knew no more. But I honor his memory, for he was very valiant. He died to save us, my kinsman Meriadoc and myself, waylaid in the woods by the soldiery of the Dark Lord. And though he fell and failed, my gratitude is none the less.
Then Pippin looked the old man in the eye, for pride stirred strangely within him, still stung by the scorn and suspicion in that cold voice.
Little service, no doubt, will so great a lord of men think to find a hobbit, yet such as it is, I will offer it in payment of my debt.
Twitching aside his grey cloak, Pippin drew forth his small sword and laid it at Denethor's feet. A pale smile, like a gleam of cold sun on a winter's evening, passed over the old man's face. But he bent his head and held out his hand, laying the shards of the horn aside. Give me the weapon, he said. Pippin lifted it and presented the hilt to him. Whence came this? Said Denethor.
Many years lie on it. Surely it is a blade wrought by your own kindred in the north in the deep past. It came out of the mounds that lie on the borders of my country,
said Pippin.
But only evil wights dwell there now, and I will not willingly tell more of them.
I see that strange tales are woven about you, said Denethor. And once again it is shown that looks may belie the man, or the halfling. I accept your service, for you are not daunted by words, and you have courteous speech, strange though the sound of it may be to us in the south. And we shall have need of all folk of courtesy, be they great or small, in the days to come. Swear to me now, said Gandalf.
I am,
said Pippin. The old man laid the sword along his lap, and Pippin put his hand to the hilt, and said slowly after Denethor, Here do I swear fealty and service to Gondor, and to the Lord and Steward of the realm.
Here do I swear fealty and service to Gondor, and to the Lord and Steward of the realm.
To speak and to be silent.
To speak and to be silent.
To do and to let be.
To do and to let be.
To come and go in need or plenty.
To come and go in need or plenty.
In peace or war, in living or dying.
In peace or war, in living or dying.
From this hour henceforth, until my Lord release me, or death take me.
From this hour henceforth, until my Lord release me, or death take me.
Or the world end, or the world end.
So say I, Peregrine, son of Paladin of the Shire of the Halflings.
So say I, Peregrine, son of Paladin, of the Shire of the Halflings.
And this do I hear, Denethor, son of Icthelion, Lord of Gondor, Steward of the High King, and will not forget it, nor fail to reward that which is given. Fealty with love, valor with honor, oath-breaking with vengeance.
Then Pippin received back his sword and put it in his sheath.
And now, said Denethor, my first command to you,
Speak and be not silent.
tell me your full tale, and see that you will recall all that you can of Boromir, my son. Sit now and begin.
As he spoke, he struck a small silver gong that stood near his footstool, and at once servants came forward. Pippin saw then that they had been standing in alcoves on either side of the door, unseen, as he and Gandalf entered.
Bring wine and food and seats for the guests,
Said Denethor.
and see that none trouble us for 1 hour. It is all I have to spare, for there is much else to heed.
He said to Gandalf.
Much of more import it may seem, and yet to me less pressing. But maybe we can speak again at the end of the day, and earlier it is to be hoped,
Said Gandalf.
for I have not ridden hither from Isengard 150 leagues with the speed of wind only to bring you one small warrior, however courteous. Is it not to you that Theoden has fought a great battle and that Isengard is overthrown, and that I have broken the staff of Saruman? It is much to me, but I know already sufficient of these deeds for my own counsel against the menace of the East.
He turned his dark eyes on Gandalf, and now Pippin saw a likeness between the two, and he felt the strain between them, almost as if he saw a line of smouldering fire, drawn from eye to eye, that might suddenly burst into flame. Denethor looked indeed much more like a great wizard than Gandalf did, more kingly, beautiful and powerful, and older. Yet by a sense older than sight, Pippin perceived that Gandalf had the greater power, and the deeper wisdom, and a majesty that was veiled. He was older, far older. How much older? He wondered. And then he thought how odd it was that he had never thought about it before. Treebeard had said something about wizards, but even then he had not thought of Gandalf as one of them. What was Gandalf? In what far time and place did he come into the world, and when would he leave it? And then his musings broke off, and he saw that Denethor and Gandalf still looked at each other in the eye, as if reading the other's mind. But it was Denethor who first withdrew his gaze.
Yea,
He said,
for though the stones be lost, they say, still the lords of Gondor have keener sight than lesser men, and many messages come to them. But sit now.
Then men came, bearing a chair and a low stool, and one brought a salver with a silver flagon and cups and white cakes. Pippin sat down, but he could not take his eyes from the old lord. Was it so, or had he only imagined it, that as he spoke of the stones a sudden gleam of his eye had glanced upon Pippin's face?
Now tell me your tale, my liege,
Said Denethor, half kindly, half mockingly.
for the words of one whom my son so befriended will be welcome indeed.
Pippin never forgot that hour in the great hall under the piercing eye of the Lord of Gondor, stabbed ever and anon by his shrewd questions, and all the while conscious of Gandalf at his side, watching and listening, and, so Pippin felt, holding in check a rising wrath and impatience. When the hour was over and Denethor again rang the gong, Pippin felt worn out. It cannot be more than 9 o'clock, he thought. I could now eat 3 breakfasts on end,
Lead the Lord Mithrandir to the house prepared for him,
said Denethor.
and his companion may lodge with him for the present if he will. But be it known that I have now sworn him into my service, and he shall be known as Peregrine, son of Paladin, and taught the lesser passwords. Send words to the captain that they shall wait on me here, as soon as may be after the 3rd hour is rung. And you, my lord Mithrandir, shall come too, as and when you will. None shall hinder your coming to me at any time, save only in my brief hours of sleep. Let your wrath at an old man's folly run off, and then return to my comfort. Folly,
said Gandalf.
Nay, my lord. When you are a dotard, you will die. You can use even your grief as a cloak.